If you guys don't know who I am, I'm the acting Chief Executive Officer. My name is Mike Gallant, and I'm happy to welcome you to our second virtual panel in our Roundtable Series project, Opportunities in COVID-19, Government and Education Systems Modernization. For those of you who are new and unfamiliar with the Roundtable Series project at the Hay Institute, it's designed to demonstrate the value and impact of federal and local policymaking based on the human security approach, identify best practices, and share learned lessons and train experts inside and outside decision-making entities to develop new collaborations. Today, we are a world transitioning from stay-at-home to safer at home as the global case numbers continue to drop and governments decide on how best to transition to our new normal. School doors, however, from kindergarten to universities have been shut down for the remainder of the academic year across the United States and the world, with a vigorous debate on what to do this coming fall and in the years to come. Students and teachers are being forced to take the hard transition from being in the classroom to being behind a computer screen, and legislatures are being forced to adapt in these unique times as well. The House of Representatives voted for the first time to hold a remote voting session, and many state legislatures are handling bill hearings and budget negotiations via video conference. The public lockdowns associated with the public health response to COVID-19 have created many hardships, but have unlocked many opportunities. One such opportunity has been forcing and accelerating the modernization of government education systems. Social distancing practices and quarantine orders have pushed these sectors to utilize their existing resources and to explore new ones in order to stay in service. This roundtable will discuss the way these changes have come to place and what impact they have on post-COVID-19 life. I have the great honor of introducing our guest speaker for the evening before the panel begins. Her name is Cori, and she works on technology and policy projects with a goal of helping governments better serve the public. She is the Director of Data and Digital at Georgetown Beckert Center for Social Impact and Innovation, and the co-founder of the U.S. Digital Response. Previously, Cori served as the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer, and from 2013 to 2017 at the White House, Cori led the Open Data and Digital Government portfolios, which includes U.S. work with the Open Government Partnership, as well as helping to stand up and support new federal tech teams, including the U.S. Digital Service, 18F, and the Presidential Innovation Fellows. Before that, Cori was the First Amendment and Freedom of Information attorney. She is the president of the board of directors for Muckrock, a nonprofit collaborative news site in the United States that promotes transparency and informed democracy, and also serves on the advisory council for the International Center of Nonprofit Law. Cori, floor is yours.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Thanks to the team at the Hay Center for making this space for our conversation tonight. So government modernization, which is an aspect of tonight's program, has been a cornerstone of my work for the past 6 or 7 years. When healthcare.gov failed to launch in October 2013 to meet the needs of the health policy initiative, I was 3 weeks in at the White House. I was sitting in the office of the US Chief Technology Officer, and some of my tech colleagues jumped right in to help. Meanwhile, I was a policy nerd, did not have the tech chops to be useful in that moment exactly, but our time came. And so it was in the months after that, in 2014, where we really had an opportunity to help government transform the way that it delivers technology and just the way that it thinks about tech to achieve its goals. So new teams came together, including the U.S. Digital Service, which sits at the White House, and 18F, which sits within the General Services Administration. And it was an opportunity to enhance the dozens of agency teams that already existed and give them more support and capacity to do the work that they need to do to carry out missions and deliver services to millions and millions of Americans. So cut to this year, when the reality of COVID hit back in March, I was working with some colleagues on some of our kind of day job efforts to bring together state and local digital leaders to talk about what they were seeing and experiencing in ordinary times. We had to cancel our in-person gathering in early March and instead had an online conversation. And of course, the topic quickly veered to COVID needs and COVID response. And the folks in US cities and states were kind of drowning in what was happening around them and the uncertainty that we were all feeling. And I don't have to tell any of you that on a good day, governments don't have the data and tech systems or skills they need to deliver on their missions. So when there's an emergency, like the Affordable Care Act healthcare.gov website being inoperable, or this moment here with COVID, those very thin data and tech operations in our government systems come under even more strain. And at the same time, our country has the most incredible tech talent there is. The innovative companies being launched in my backyard and Travis's here in the Bay Area, and in all of our backyards across the country. All of these companies, all of these efforts are being built by innovative, creative Americans. And we've learned in the last few months, many of them want to use their skills to make the world a better place and to be helpful in this moment. So we launched US Digital Response to tap into that incredible pool of talent of folks who had started to raise their hands to say they wanted to use their skills as data scientists or web developers or user experience designers or content writers to help their communities in this moment. We may not have much to offer by way of healthcare response or first line, first responder efforts otherwise, but techies do have a unique way of showing up, and it's been really incredible to see now nearly 6,000 technologists across the United States raise their hands to say they wanted to pitch in some way in COVID response using those tech skills. So what have we been up to? With nearly 6,000 volunteers in the system, we have paired them with close to 100 different government teams across the country at all levels, mostly at state and local governments, so cities or counties or states, to work on a whole variety of projects that are that have the common thread of being open source with a goal of being replicated or scaled to other communities around the country or even around the world. Some of those have been very basic needs, like, as many of us know, governments are not generally equipped, especially like a city government, to send all of their workers home to work remotely. And so some of the first requests were just helping governments get to work, be able to work online, helping them digitize paper forms, helping them set up VPNs, virtual private networks, so they could work securely from home, some of those basic skills. Over time, the projects evolved and involved helping build tools so that small business owners could understand what financial support they qualify for. A tool that was launched in New Jersey and has now been scaled to a number of states. The teams are working on some oversight tracking for all of the stimulus funds that are coming in and will be continuing to kind of trickle into the state and local governments in the month ahead that have a lot of robust transparency and oversight requirements. So there's a whole number of projects that are going on, and they're all really exciting. And I think one of the most fun ways that the US Digital Response has been able to scale is very meta, but it's kind of scaled or replicated itself. And we've heard from a number of other countries that have reached out to say that they built a similar response effort in their home countries based on what we were up to. So in Mexico, it's called Brigada Digital, and that launched maybe about a month or so after we did. And our website and everything was all open source, and we encouraged anyone to borrow and adapt it. So the Mexican Brigada Digital website was pretty much a mirror image of ours, only in Spanish. And their work is really excitedly rolling out, and they're working with governments and with NGOs throughout the country to help in this moment. We spoke with some colleagues in Berlin who launched the German version of Digital Response and have a great effort that's growing there, and folks in Argentina, and there's all kinds of exciting efforts on their own happening in the UK and Europe. And so it's been really neat to see this kind of global wave of community involvement and just social support that techies have been able to bring in this moment. And I hope we'll see more of these opportunities arising for some of these skills to be used in service of better tech ed. And I know that's a big focus of tonight's conversation as well, how we can be kind of leveraging the moment we're in for additional opportunities around education. So I also wanted to briefly mention US Digital Response is amazing. It's a fully volunteer-run effort, and it's going on now month 3 of existence, so we're working on a long-term plan. And for most of us who are involved, we actually all have day jobs somewhere else where we're busy doing what we ordinarily do. And so for me, I'm at Georgetown University. Don't hold that against us, George Washington. But I'm over at Georgetown working at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, where for the last year I've been leading a portfolio on data and digital projects. We bring in practitioners, folks who've worked in the public interest world, so whether in the public sector, coming out of governments, or for public interest-minded organizations or companies, and they bring projects into the Beck Center to focus on ways that we can use data and technology to have better outcomes for society. A couple of those projects are particularly relevant tonight. Tee up a handoff to our panel. The great work that Travis has been doing with TechCongress and the great work that the Data Coalition has going on, and that Karina and team are leading. Also, by the way, my full name is Karina, so to have 2 Karinas in one tiny little setup is amazing, and 2 Ravis. So anyway, the great work that's happening on the Modernizing Congress front that Travis and team have been leading, and Karina and team have been leading. We also have a fellow at Georgetown, Lorelei Kelly, who's been doing a whole bunch of work on how Congress can set itself up for remote hearings and remote voting. And that's a drumbeat she's been beating for 20 years, and like now is her moment. So never before, has there been an opportunity for that work to really take center stage. Similarly, we have another project on the team being led by a couple of fellows who've been researching the tech-enabled social safety net. So right now, not only are our government technological systems under strain, but much of what is causing some of that strain is the need for more Americans now than ever to be applying for government assistance, whether that's through food stamps or housing assistance or unemployment insurance or small business loans. All of these systems are coming under great strain and duress. We've all seen the headlines of systems crashing, websites going down. And at US Digital Response, we've been able to help out with a number of those efforts. And over on my team at Georgetown, we've had a couple of researchers digging into what tech solutions have sprung up in recent years to be useful for governments to adopt. And now's their moment to shine, so that we can really put those tech-enabled and kind of data-driven options in front of governments who need answers right now of actual tools they can start to deploy and unstick some of these overburdened systems. So it's been a really challenging time for all of us as we navigate everything going on around us in our personal and professional lives. But I think it's also just such an opportune time for some of these really impactful things we care about to have the attention and energy and headlines where we can get some great work done. And so I'm glad that we're all having this conversation here tonight to learn more about how education and tech overall can be really leveraged in this exciting moment, and to try and work together for a better future as we all come back online in the weeks and months ahead. So again, thanks to the Hay Institute for having me, and I'm looking forward to the rest of tonight's program.
Thank you, Cori. My name is Ravi Hutheesing, and I'm the moderator for the panel this evening. Thank you for the introduction. And I am one person who will not give you a hard time for Georgetown University, because I was born at Georgetown University Hospital. So there you go. But so many interesting things that you said. And certainly when we think about technology and we think about how the average family is experiencing technology today, a lot of it's through education. A lot of it is through bringing education online into the home, and we're all discovering the limitations of it, as well as we're discovering the opportunities with it. And I think that's where this conversation starts to become really interesting tonight. As I said, my name is Ravi Hutheesing. I'm an international keynote speaker and a cultural catalyst, and one of my focuses are education audiences. So I often speak to education leadership, superintendents associations, principal associations, and really talking about the future of education and how do we make education relevant in an age of artificial intelligence and globalization. So obviously technology is a huge part of that. But the other side of it too, where I find technology to be very interesting, is that I also serve as a cultural diplomat for the U.S. Department of State. And in that capacity, I create a lot of arts programs to create global unity. Now, a lot of those things are done in person, but we often use technology to maintain those relationships across the world. So technology becomes a very important unifier and tool for unity on a global level. And ultimately, we got to pivot, and that's what the world is doing right now together. If there's anything that we're all united in, it is that need and opportunity to pivot, because we are discovering it's an ever-changing future. And so I'm glad the High Institute is also putting on these panels. I've been on the advisory board, I think, since the inception of this organization. So it's great to be part of it as the moderator tonight. So we've got some terrific panelists to offer a range of discussion that can keep entertaining and exciting, and the conversations can sometimes become very tech oriented, but certainly try and make it open so that all of us can enjoy what we have to say. Travis Moore, founder, director of TechCongress, is with us. Karina Turvis, the policy manager for the Data Coalition, is with us, and Ravi Chaturvedi, research director for the Institute for Business in the Global Context at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I hope I got that all right. If nothing else, as Karina said in the opening, we have cornered the market on panels that have Karina's and Ravi's involved. So that is something, if nothing else, that we can take to the bank on this one tonight. So I'd like to maybe lead it off with my namesake here, with Ravi, and have him tell us a little bit about this project, the Idea 2030 that you've been working on, because this is about the digital economy, right? We all know the economy is essentially what runs everything. And so from a tech standpoint of view, I think this probably ties into the CARES Act and unemployment and everything. What are we seeing from the digital economy? Not only, I know you've dissected it, what did you call it? The uneven state of the nation. You've dissected the various states, but maybe you can put that in context also with the rest of the country. What's happening and what has COVID-19 revealed? Are you able to hear me, Ravi? Well, I think he's trying to get his audio set up. And while I do that, I just want to invite everybody who's listening that if you would like to post a question, there's a chat box in the bottom right, and you can post a chat question anytime, and I'll see it and we'll get the panelists. Ravi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry. I was having audio connectivity issues, so I'll miss the last couple of minutes, and I'm assuming they were, the most important things that you were saying. I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay. This is, why not? This is, technology has its limitations. And in a sense, it's great that we can acknowledge that and help people understand how we are going to overcome that and develop it. So I was just referring to your Idea 2030, the digital economy, and basically the uneven state of the nation, I think, as you call it. And I'm curious as to what COVID-19 has taught us about ourselves as a country, but also in the context of the rest of the world. What are we learning about this digital economy, and what do we need to do with it?
Absolutely. Thank you, first of all, and Cori, thanks for kicking it off, and terrific to hear about so many wonderful overlaps. And by the way, I've also heard great stuff about you from our friends at the Rockefeller Foundation, who, by the way, are great raving fans of yours. So in case you didn't already know. I mean, so IDEA 2030, the idea behind IDEA 2030 was really to imagine a digital economy for all. That's the full acronym. And the idea is to look at how can digital technologies help catalyze and help us realize as a society, as a world, the Sustainable Development Goals and at least 2/3 of the goals could potentially have some element of digital technology, if not more, that can act as a tremendous catalyst. So that's the sort of overarching idea behind IDEA 2030, the two big issues of our time being the pervasiveness of digital technology and the other being, the insurmountable challenges that we have. Now, obviously, as we just kicked off this research, the world went into a lockdown, and what we are probably witnessing is, what one could call the purest test of the internet. I mean, the only economy working today is the digital economy. There is nothing else that is working in whatever way it is working right now. So we are living through, the purest test of the internet, and it was fascinating for us in the first turn of the sort of tank. What we did is we looked at which countries around the world are even ready for a socially distanced mode of working, and within that we looked at three critical aspects. If not, one was which countries are catered out to even work remotely from home or while in lockdown. The second was looking at which countries have an infrastructure for e-commerce to happen, and so because our groceries and our medicines are, being delivered to our doorstep today in a no contact delivery mode. And the third was, digital media. I mean, because I have absolutely no idea how our ancestors survived the pandemic of 1918 without Netflix. But in more ways than one, I think it makes surviving this lockdown a lot more or living through this lockdown a lot more bearable. So we looked at these, and infrastructure is a key aspect. Last mile connectivity and all kinds of last mile abilities in the country are a key factor. And then we looked at that, and we looked at about 42 countries and which countries are ready and which countries aren't. That was one phase of work. The second phase of work that we did following that was as weeks turned into, or rather days turned into weeks, and slowly into months, which countries have the right, which governments have the ability to deliver public services digitally. And when we think about the fact that, the United States we have had 100,000 deaths, millions is the number around the world. Even if we were to just think about a simple thing like a death certificate, which becomes a trigger for many people to either get some kinds of benefits from the government and or from, be the insurance benefits, et cetera, et cetera. It's a trigger for many things to happen, and which governments are even able to deliver that death certificate digitally. So, and many number of public services digitally. So we looked at that, and I'm happy to share those links. I should have had those slides ready so I could share all of that with you. My apologies that I don't. So we did that, and then we looked at the United States. The fun part is the United States at an aggregate level does extremely well, but then again, what we've been seeing is there's a bit of a patchwork approach to dealing with the pandemic, to put it very mildly. So what we did over the last few weeks is we turned our engines towards the United States. And we said, let's take a look at, if you were to think of these 50 states of the Union, as we would the European Union, for lack of a better term, which states are doing the right thing, which states aren't, and how is this even working? So the first phase of work that we did was we looked at, Google mobility data to see, a month between, the 16th of March to the 16th of April. And we looked at Google mobility data, and we looked at where did mobility drop off. And this is comparing to the baseline, right? So all of us going to work, our usual movements pre-COVID, and post lockdown, where have movements come down, where have movements not come down. That gives you a bit of a fascinating picture. And then we also looked at rates of transmission across states as a bit of a proxy for government responsiveness, state government responsiveness. And when we juxtapose the two, you get a very fascinating grid. And if I can share, I do have these slides, but I'm absolutely not sure of how to do this on WebEx. I know how to do this on Zoom, but I don't know how to do this on WebEx.
Maybe what we can do is we can get those slides from you after the fact and somehow attach it to recording of this, because that would probably be good for people to dissect the information. I think you sent me some of them, and there's a lot of good info on there that I think people could probably dissect afterwards.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm happy to send a couple of articles that we wrote about this as well, on the country level comparison. And when you look at this, what you get is a very fascinating picture of, where are citizens more compliant on the one hand, and where are governments more responsive. And then you get a set of states like New York and Massachusetts, where I live, where there is a high level of compliance by residents, and also a high level of responsiveness by the government. And then there are states like Georgia, which are somewhere in the middle. Not the responsiveness at the state level was not great, but citizens, surprisingly, even though they were, they took their cues, or rather, if I can say this among friends, they probably used common sense. And then, their mobility dropped off. And then there are some other states like South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska and others, where mobility hasn't. And when we start looking at, when you start double clicking on that, these are all the states where most of our food and meat production facilities in this country come from. And that work happens in very close proximity with each other. So as you project this out, what you're seeing is there are obviously, and as we kind of think about the uneven state of the nation, there are many levels of unevenness. One level of unevenness is what we call the vocation-volition unevenness. So just the notion of socializing on the coast, if you will, is primarily volitional in the sense that we go to bars, we go to restaurants, et cetera, but we are mostly largely, our trade is information, and we could do it sitting at home. But in the states where most of the mobility has not dropped, socializing is vocational because they go to a place of work, stand cheek by jowl to get stuff done. So there is a vocation-volition divide. That's one aspect that we are unpacking as we speak. The other aspect that we are unpacking as we speak, and this is a plug, we're doing a webinar with Cori, 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 the Rural Institute and the Urban Institute on the 10th of June, and I'll make sure to send the webinar link around. We are looking at what are the digital divisions between states. Where are the urban-rural divides? And where are divides within, urban America, intra-urban divides? And where are the broadband deserts, so to speak? Because increasingly we are hitting a point where, broadband access is not a luxury, is not a nice to have, it's a necessity at the time when we're living through the purest test of the internet. So I know I threw a lot. I'm going to pause there.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, and that's what we're seeing. It reminds me when we talk about the digital economy, and what I talk a lot about to my audience is the sharing economy, which is predominantly digital. I learned it the hard way back in 1997 when I was the guitar player of the band Hanson. And just 2 years later, Napster came and destroyed the recording industry, basically, because we didn't know how to monetize it. We didn't know how to work with P2P sharing and this new digital economy and sharing economy. So it's really interesting. And then when you look at it in modern day now, when we look at technology, and we look at how inexpensive technology is becoming, technology deflation. So that means that technology's role at an increasing rate can start to become the real tool for governments, for education, for everybody in the home. I mean, we have so many devices. And what are those devices doing? Every single one of them, from our thermostat to our phone to our computer, is tapping into that broadband. And now everybody's home, tapping into it with their kids at home, trying to educate. And I'm currently on what was a 3-week trip to Chile. I just entered my 4th month down here because of lack of flights, lack of services, and even my bandwidth is being stretched here on the coast of Chile because there's just not enough for everybody in these towns and areas. So we're all living it in some way, which I think is really interesting. But here's the question I want to pose to Travis, because what I find interesting being here in what is in many ways a third world country right now, and I do a lot of work in third world countries like India and Chile, but live in the United States, is the leapfrog effect. Because there's a lot of countries that are not tied to their infrastructure, that now have the digital ability to leapfrog over countries like the United States that are so invested in its infrastructure. And I'm imagining that this is true in governments as well. And I'm wondering if our government, if their mobility is in some way, in comparison to other countries, inhibited by infrastructure when it could be much more efficient through technology.
Yeah, that's a great question, and so thanks so much for having me. And I guess I'll be the lone solo person, or person without a name twin on the panel here. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of Cori can speak to this in the executive branch, of course. Legacy systems, and then also legacy norms and traditions are huge barriers to our institutions modernizing. And Congress is a paper-based institution. I mean, it really is a 19th century institution. I mean, to give you one example, the coronavirus hits, the week of March 8th, 9th, 10th. This is the same week that appropriations letters are due in Congress. So this is another arcane thing. Members of Congress organize sign-on letters with other members saying you should fund the National Institutes of Health at X amount of dollars, or you should fund the Federal Highway Administration at Y amount of dollars. They get all their members to sign on to this. So these letters are due. Congress doesn't have a method for digital signatures. And offices are closing down left and right. You have the first staffers that have tested positive. You have a number of members that are already in quarantine. And the Appropriations Committee, because they don't have a method for digital signatures in Congress, is saying, if you want your appropriations letter to be valid, it needs to be signed in ink pen. And so you had all these interns running, crisscrossing the hallways to get, with these manila envelopes with their blue felt tip pens, paper clipped on, to get hundreds of signatures on thousands of letters. And then someone on one of the closed listservs said, hey, what if one of these people is asymptomatic, or what if one of them is working sick? You infect the entirety of the legislative branch. So Congress and our executive branch, I mean, they run on traditions and norms, and until there is a crisis moment, I mean, I think we saw this in the executive branch. Healthcare.gov hit. Cori was there at that moment, and all of a sudden there's a crisis, and there's a realization that governments need to transform. I think we're seeing that moment in Congress, but you're absolutely right that, I mean, I think you see in newer governments like Estonia, some of the Latin American nations that have, like Chile, like Argentina, that have much more deliberative democracies, because they're sort of building from scratch. They have a blanker slate, and these norms and traditions do make innovation in government a lot harder.
Yeah, one of the things I also talk a lot about is the decentralization, as we're talking about, and the idea of the sharing economy, but also the democratization of knowledge. The decentralization and democratization of everything becomes much more possible when we're dealing in the digital realm. And that's what I'd see in countries like Chile, is what people can do by bypassing sort of the behemoth in the middle. Solar power is even a good example. You know, you just see so many more solar panels on homes that are bypassing, you know, the big grid. And in many ways, that sort of localization or that access to peer-to-peer and decentralizing allows everything from education systems that I assume to governments to leapfrog. So I'm curious, in taking that idea of where we are, the majority of families are experiencing technology, I would think, based on their kids being home and trying to get their lessons and online. And the education systems around the world have been desperately trying to make this transition, and have done so with almost no standardization and no equality. So there's a big problem with remediation when students get back to school in the fall, or in the fall up there in the Northern Hemisphere, in the spring down here, whether they, you know, continue. And the summer slide and all of that, they've been on vacation for so long, or going into vacation, depending on the hemisphere. So what's interesting about this situation is that at the end of the year in the United States, we're not even testing. We're not even acquiring this data that's really important for making sure that students are placed well next year. And in fact, all these students are going to return to school, and teachers aren't going to have the data that they're used to having, or administrators or counselors, to sit with all these students. So, Karina, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing, the Data Coalition, and how that impacts education. What can we do when we have this gap in data? What's a substitute for it, or how do we make up for it? How do we reintroduce data?
Sure. And remember that from the federal perspective, education data already has quite a bit of gaps that need to be addressed. So not only, you know, standardization and centralization are some of the most effective things you can do to have well-managed data in order to make effective evidence-based policies on that. And how the education system in the United States has worked, as there is a lot of local control, and there are significant benefits to that. But when it comes to having a centralized repository to evaluate outcomes for students, those become much harder. In fact, in 2008, records ban, which means that student level data, so you know, individual demographic information, geographical location, and all of that is not able to be reported to the National Center for Education Statistics, which is a recognized statistical agency which has confidentiality protections. So when COVID hit, the Data Coalition sent an open letter to Congress about what we can do in this time of disruption to make sure there is a continuity of data. And one of the significant things that we brought up was lifting this student unit records ban to start collecting this data in a privacy protected, responsible way in order to get a handle on how educational outcomes are impacted by this. So we may have a test score missing for a student, but we might understand then, you know, how this impacted fourth graders versus how this impacted eighth graders versus how this impacted, you know, incoming freshmen. And then as well as expanding our data, expanding our access across data silos. So maybe there is a way through a national secure data service to connect those individual student records to IRS records, and then make a connection to individual earnings over a lifetime. So this becomes, and education is such a tricky subject because it is so important on an individual level that missing a test, missing a year in school can be extremely detrimental to an individual student. But when we're talking about policy interventions, having this longitudinal comprehensive data set is how we make good evidence-based policies. So as we're looking to think about the gaps in this data that we really need to start thinking about it in a longitudinal way. Investments to ensure that we are able to make these important connections and that researchers have this data available to them.
Let's break down that down a little bit more, the longitudinal way. Like, for example, what does that really mean? How do we find, what is that direction of the data? In other words, are you basically saying that from a policy standpoint, we really need to continue to have these summative style of assessments in order to be able to create policy based on hard data?
Essentially, imagine you have, well, one great example of the impact of making data linkages across long-term was Raj Chetty's recent study about opportunity zones and how, what were the professional and economic outcomes for students across quite a variety of cohorts. So early cohorts to see how they, what was their income level in their 20s and their 40s and all of that. So, and a crucial component of that is education data. So how do Pell Grant recipients fare 10 years out? How do, how do well-performing students on the NAEP assessment fare? If we can't find any reason, there's no difference between how this cohort of fourth graders has performed as a result of this intervention. Maybe we don't need to do it, but perhaps we find that there's a demographic change. Girls don't do as well on this. Maybe there is an intervention that we need to think about. Problems and identifying effective policy solutions are really the result of good data that is able to accommodate all of these massive structures that go into, both early childhood success and professional success later in life.
Maybe both Cori and Karina can help clear this up a little bit. One of the complicated things, I think, the other way every American at least is getting involved in data is probably through the CARES Act, whether it's the stimulus that they're getting, whether it's the small business association process of trying to get the emergency relief funding or the payroll protection. But another one that's now coming up is the schools when they go back. They're applying for funding relief, funding help in order to figure out what to do if they have to, for example, double the amount of classrooms because they need social distancing, or double the amount of buses or something like that. And then it gets even more complicated. Just yesterday, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos brought up the issue of that, well, some of this funding that's going to states also needs to go to private schools, which then becomes a very political, and as all of it's becoming very political, that has to do with COVID-19. But I'm curious from a sort of data and administrative process, how does one keep track of all of that, really? I mean, even the terms that were originally set forth for the payroll protection, for example, have had to be changed because they can't afford it or there's not enough money. So what's that process look like? Where is that, where are these policies coming from? What data is coming back to them that's causing the revision of these policies that ends up confusing a lot of people? I'll throw that out to really anyone that wants to take it, but I assume it's in the wheelhouse of one of the parties.
So that is a very good question and a very complicated question, and gets back to Travis's point about how kind of antiquated our government systems are. So first open data law was passed in 2014 with the Data Act, which required government spending be reported in a standardized, accessible format. And now, that's in the process of being implemented, still, several years down the line. The GREAT Act passed last year, which tracks the spending data for grants as well as direct federal spending. And the CARES Act put in a lot of these oversight mechanisms as well, that how you are spending federal money and what programs they are need to be tracked in a way that is accessible and transparent. This is then in combination with other laws like the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which passed in 2018, that requires federal agencies to have a chief data officer, increase evaluation activities. So these questions of, as we're spending trillions of dollars, knowing where that money is going, how well it's performing is really very hard to do, especially in such a large enterprise when you have these antiquated systems. So Congress and the executive branch have been making moves to improve this kind of thing, but we are really in a sense of urgency in order to have effective oversight of this money. It really is a question of getting, we know where we want to be, but getting there is becoming more and more pressing.
Are we more of a mess in this way than maybe some other countries?
There are some countries that are doing a fantastic job. Estonia was brought up. Australia has a great business, reporting system. But, we are also, the US federal government is one of the largest enterprises on the planet. So it is orders of magnitude larger than some of the questions that face other countries. But, we're much farther behind than of the private sector. The private sector is light years ahead of where the federal government is.
Right. And in our own defense, we are a complicated country. We have a lot of diversity. We have a lot of different issues, that some other countries don't. And that also contributes to the complexity of all of this, including 50 somewhat independent states, which must make federal programs really, really complicated. So I want to throw out a question to everybody, really, and see what answers we get. We know that there's a lot of improvements that can be made in technology that we're learning right now. So if you had to pick maybe one or two of the most significant improvements that we need to make in the technology aspect of this, I'd like to hear that from each of you. But I'd also like to know what you think we are doing right now with technology that will never work, because it comes back down to the water cooler, the human connection, the teacher-student relationship, whatever that might be in your own spheres. Anyone who wants to take it first, just go for it.
I love this question. So I'm going to start with what won't work. Then we can end on a high note. What won't work is continuing to treat tech as a separate implementation thing. By failing to factor in that technology will be the way that we achieve our policy goals, deliver services, carry out our missions, by failing to factor that in at the very beginning, we set ourselves up for a poor handoff and a bad execution. We've seen it time and again. We've just listed a number of failed instances on this 49-minute journey. So what won't work is continuing to treat tech as an implementation tool rather than having tech at the table from the beginning. We used to call it TQ, tech quotient, like IQ or EQ. You have to have your TQ in the conversation and at the policy making table. So what do we need to do, or what am I hopeful for with tech? If tech isn't the solution or isn't just an implementation mechanism, we know it's always about the people. And having a strategy reflects the type of outcomes and outputs and tech execution we'd like to see is really key. So having technologists or people who speak tech, translators, in the highest levels of all of our agencies, in all of our congressional offices, we need to make sure that we're really thinking about talent with more of a tech-forward approach and not as a separate skill set. I think in a generation or less, we're probably going to just see workers who show up with all of these skills. We're teaching computer science more and more. We're just teaching and learning I'm not a digital native, but it's not far behind me. And I think we're just going to see a different type of worker in the future. The talent question will perhaps be moot. But for now, I think we have to be really thoughtful in how we approach humans and people and talent.
Great. Anyone who wants to take it next?
I can dive in, and I'm probably not going to say anything much different than Cori, but because I actually think we had virtually the same answer that I had in my head. And there are people that want to do this work. It's incumbent on government to create the spaces for them. We launched our application for our Congressional Digital Service Fellowship and had it open for 12 days, and we had 268 people apply. That included some very, very high level people coming out of the tech industry, and 60 plus people that had served on a government tech team. People want to do this work in Congress. Congress doesn't have a place for them right now. And so I think every committee in Congress should have a chief technologist, just like it has a chief counsel. I think this is where real political leadership is required. And there are a handful of, I think, newer members that are standing up and saying that we need this infusion of talent, and guess what? Also, we need budgets. Because technologists cost money. The average staff, you can't pay a technologist $55K, which is what a legislative assistant in the House is going to make. So I think it's investments, and then it's political leadership to say we want to have these people, and we're making space for them. And the Obama administration and the Trump administration today with U.S. Digital Service has done this in a limited form, but we need this at every level of government, because tech isn't just a slice of the policy making pie; it's the crust. I mean, it cuts it is under every issue. And to get to your earlier question about service delivery, the CARES Act. We have huge numbers of people that are falling through the safety net because the way that it was designed, they're not eligible for unemployment, or they're missing SNAP benefits. And that's in part where what the tech industry has done well is it puts users at the center, and it iterates. And we need that approach to policymaking, where policymakers are testing their solutions at the outset before they are signed into law and implemented, because without that, you end up with a CARES Act where 40% of the people that were intended to get unemployment insurance or food stamps aren't taking it up because of behavioral reasons, or because of the law was written in an imprecise way. So I think we have a lot to learn from tech, and so much of it has to do with the talent in the building, per Cori's comments.
Great. Ravi, do you have sorry, go ahead.
There was one thing that is absolutely not working is the absolute in technology. I think, especially for agencies that it's very crucial for, the Office of Management and Budget, the legislature, there is a culture of wanting to be seen not investing in yourself on that front. But legislature, especially the Office of Management and Budget, GSA, plays such a role in helping bring other agencies along. So the thing that is not working is these agencies not investing in their technology and in their data. They really need to realize that that's something that is worth the investment and will ultimately save so much money down the line. If there was one thing that I would love to see, is no more PDFs in the federal government. Would love everything to be in a markup structured language. That just truly no more PDFs.
Sounds good. No more PDFs. Ravi, what do you think?
Ravi, I need you to repeat that question one more time so I make sure I understood it the way you intended.
Just essentially that we are now at a time where we are seeing the shortcomings and potential of technology. So what are the one or two things that we can really do and need to do with technology that we're not doing today? And then the other side of that question is, what are we trying to do with technology that we shouldn't, that we should still leave to the person-to-person, the handshake, the social interaction?
So what is it that we should be doing that we aren't doing well enough? I think both in the United States and pretty much around the world is, I mean, again, going back to the idea that we are living through what is possibly the purest test, and the most unimaginable science experiment of what if the world existed just on the internet. And what we are seeing is, even if you were to just think about, the government relief checks going to people, checks. I mean, I just said checks, and I can't believe I said checks. Who writes checks? This is the only country in the world that still sends out checks. We are
a country that signs a credit card slip.
That too. So when we start, even if we were to just start thinking about small little things, what the pandemic has done in more ways than one is it has forced most Americans who still tend to be very cash centric, and that is it is a function of demographics. It is also a function of socioeconomic abilities that are pretty uneven. We have not established transitional infrastructure. So today, nobody wants to give and take and exchange paper money, given that there is a pandemic around us. And who's left behind are people who primarily dealt in cash. And funnily enough, it is people who are of the older generation. And what is most problematic is they are most susceptible to the coronavirus. So when we think about what we've not done is establish any kind of transitional infrastructure that can help people move along. I don't think we've done that well. And when we start thinking about those things, I think they become very evident. And second, again, I can't say enough about how the digital broadband inclusion of everyone is a crying need. I cannot understand how the greatest digital economy on the planet has not enshrined universal access to broadband as a right. That needs to change. What is it that we cannot do with tech? So I was an advisor to the Estonian government for a while, and they claim that 98% of all their public services and interaction with the government can be done digitally. There are only 3 things that you cannot do digitally in Estonia. One is, I think marriages cannot be done digitally, but I think Governor Cuomo made officiating marriages via Skype and Zoom a thing. But from last I remember, I think there are about 2 or 3 services that the Estonians don't do digitally, and they still believe you need an element of a physical handshake. I can't exactly recall what those 3 things are, but if the Estonians have figured out that these 3 things technology can just not work in, they're probably right.
I think the idea of transitional infrastructure is so important because that's probably the biggest gap between technology working and not. And in some senses, that's what we're seeing with schools and education. There was no time for transition, for the transition really from the classroom to the online. But there is time for the transition from online to the classroom, which is a lot of the things that I try to work with my clients on and how we're going to do that. So I'm curious if each of you have any advice for educators, for schools, for school systems, as they bring students back to school. What do you think are the maybe top 3 things that they are going to have to address and the best ways for them to address them from a technology integration standpoint? Whoever's mic unmutes first, it's like Jeopardy. Who wants to take it? I mean, I think one from a data standpoint, obviously the biggest thing that they're going to have to figure out is what grade every kid goes in, if we still have grades. at the end of this? If that's still, and that actually could be an interesting question too, is what do you think is going to be the paradigm shift that we're going to see in the way we educate children as a result of all of this? And as we close out with this question as a group, we can certainly open it up to questions from anybody that's watching, or if the panelists have questions for each other, that's always interesting as well. Rita, your mic is off. That means you have something to say.
Every time I talk on these panels, people ask questions like that. And I always get the cop out of being a person who advocates for evidence-based policymaking to say, wait until the data is in. There's going to be a lot of planning and a lot of changes that are going to take place, and we don't know where it's going to take us. But I would say work very carefully and conscientiously to gather the data you need, create a learning agenda for yourself, and think about gathering the evidence that you would need in order to answer the questions you have about how to continue to educate these children. So that's kind of a cop-out of an answer. I can't really make predictions, but my advice is always to wait to see what the data says.
Just let me push you on that a little bit more. So what would be, let's say, 3 points of data that they should wait for?
That's a great question, because as a person who's not an educator, I don't really know that I can speak to expertise on that. But I think a lot of the data that's going to be important coming up is demographic data, including gender, race, and economic class. I also think there is going to be an understanding of what's going on outside the classroom for each of these students who might be experiencing housing insecurity, whose parents might be struggling to find work. That is also going to play a big role on educational attainment, and that needs to be considered when we're talking about what we're expecting of our students. And then, as much as possible, to find salient points of comparison with the data that does already exist. So while we are looking for new points, there are some, we need to find ways to make it as comparable as possible across time.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think the biggest data to figure out the timeline for all of this is the vaccine. There's a lot of things that are waiting to get more information on a vaccine before we can even figure out when kids might go back to school, when conferences, which is my big market, when we'll, as I say, my job is probably the last to come back, because for my job, everybody has to get on an airplane and go sit with a few thousand people in close quarters. So that one's not going to come back very soon. But a vaccine actually, and the progress of the vaccine gives everybody maybe some timeline. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just throwing this out there, as to when we can start to assess the data, implement the data, and actually have some results. Does that make sense? Anyone else on that point? Otherwise, we'll jump to some questions that are coming through. One question that's just come through: how can we build privacy into our data collection for those whose data we're collecting, especially given the social stigma surrounding COVID-19? Yeah, so privacy issues obviously become massive in a, how did you put it, Ravi? What if the world only existed online, on the internet? Privacy becomes an issue. So how do we deal with privacy? Even I'm reading like HIPAA laws are currently being relaxed in order to facilitate this. But people are going to, again, want their privacy back, I assume, right?
The good news on that front is we actually have a lot of great standards already in place and already being exercised at all levels of government. And those can translate right over to what we're doing with anything related to COVID. The challenging news is those standards and systems don't always work as well as they could and exactly designed perfectly. So we do have some room for growth there, but we at least have a starting point. I think the work that's been happening over the last 6-7 years, led in large part by the Data Coalition, to really encourage the federal government to develop more rigor around the way that the government manages and maintains and appropriately shares data while ensuring it protects privacy and addresses security needs. The government agencies, at least when I was still there a few years ago, were really making strides along those lines. Yes, there's still much more room for improvement. If we look at the evaluation trackers, not everyone's getting a green, but you know, those efforts have been in place for a number of years to really factor in those needs. And I think there's a lot we can learn from and start with. And then likewise, there are great tools and models and supports outside of government to provide guidance and best practices. One of the fellows on my team at the Beck Center in January published a data sharing guidebook, and who knew that that would be so prescient and needed in this moment. We really thought it would be a great resource for governments who struggle to share responsible information at any time. And now as we see states entering into agreements around contact tracing with vendors and just navigating the whole bucket of issues that comes with that, having some best practices and guidance on how to responsibly share data while protecting privacy in order to be able to draw the evidence-based conclusions we need that Karina smartly points out are what we should be looking for as we think about preparing to reopen.
Privacy concerns and how we best address them, you know, alleviate concerns, make people feel more secure about putting all the sensitive data into online forms.
I'll just put in my. I'm going to follow Karina's cue, and one of the last questions is to say, I think one of the things that we need is oversight rather than I don't knowing what prescriptions I think we should have on privacy is probably above my pay grade. But you certainly need a Congress that can have a committee hearing. You certainly need a Congress where a member of Congress can write a letter to a contact tracing app, or can haul someone in for questions. So I think one of the real, we had an entire branch of government that didn't, during the largest economic and health crisis of 3 generations, like they didn't meet for 6 weeks. That is a problem. And so, I think we definitely need oversight and we need accountability. We have a government that's checks and balances, and we need to make sure that that government has the capacity to, per Ravi's earlier comment, operate as if the world was all entirely on the internet. Only the internet exists. So I think that's our focus for the near term, and we need capable people probably crafting the privacy standards themselves as well.
Yeah, Ravi.
I just wanted to share a thought or two about privacy. I think we're the only people talking about privacy. Nobody is talking about privacy right now. At this point in time, I think, there are weddings happening on Zoom, family, Passover dinners happening on Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. So really, I don't think, as days get into weeks and weeks get into months, one thing to kind of keep in mind for all of us is, how would this, coming out of the lockdown and out of the pandemic, how would this have changed consumer behavior? And to what extent would it have been irreversible in a way that, there's so much data sharing that is, the only cathartic sharing that is happening on the internet, be it on social media, be it on Zoom, be it on, any of these video apps and what have you. So how much of that is going to snap back? I don't know. It feels like techlash and privacy were terms, from 2018 and 2019. I don't even know what 2021 will be like. I guess the point I'm trying to get to is, yes, as lawmakers definitely ought to be thinking about privacy and enforcing regulation, but I don't know, consumers and users would have probably moved on, and they may not even care. I guess, and if they don't care, I mean, I'm not saying we should not care as much as the goalpost may have moved, is the, so this, our concerns about privacy may not be the same as we emerge out of this crisis, potentially.
Yeah, I think you're right. The goalpost moves. That certainly happens. But to use the metaphor, the pendulum still swings. So it'll probably swing back as well as people start to want privacy. We saw it. Look, after 9/11, we got the Patriot Act, and everybody thought it was okay. And then it existed for a long time, and people started saying, "Well, this isn't okay." Now we know that terrorists and targeted individuals have been tracked through their phones and their locations and things like that. But now it's okay to track everybody in case they've been to a hot spot and could have, become infected with coronavirus. And I think while everybody's scared, and I don't mean fear as a tactic, I mean fear as reasonable, okay with that. But as our fears subside, probably that pendulum swings back a little bit and we start saying, okay, the goalpost has moved. I still want a little bit of my privacy back. And that becomes a real challenge, I would think, for a government, to rein that back.
It is a challenge. I mean, and I really like how you brought the Patriot Act and the airport security, examples, and that's the beauty of capitalism, right? So we went through 9/11 and we got the kind of surveillance at airports that we have not imagined. It is the most dystopian kind of surveillance at airports. That came in, and that's the beauty of capitalism. It entrenches itself, and today airport surveillance is, unless you're in New Zealand, where you could literally walk in through, with your footwear on and with a bottle of water, shocker, they still let you do it. But no other part of the world, and so it just entrenches itself, and has it snapped back? It hasn't. So if we were to kind of take the same example of that as an exogenous shock and what it has done to some, notions of our own liberties and privacy, what would this do? And with all this technology that is coming in that can track any number of things and trace, is there? I don't have an answer to it as much as if you were to look back at the post 9/11 security industrial complex, it has not gone away. It has only gotten stronger. So I don't know.
Nuance to that. There are a lot of differences between the data for enforcement agencies and the intelligence agencies. So what the FBI can do with data it's collected is a vastly different than what the Census Bureau can do with data it collects. And the privacy protections that our statistical agencies have are really very good. And the scientific experts at our statistical agencies work very hard to make sure we protect our privacy. And I also think there is a distinction between the amount of data we are willing to give up for, the convenience of Google Apps versus the privacy we're willing to give up to our government. And, there are many different factors that go into what people's feelings are on this. I personally trust my statistical agencies more than I trust Google. But at the same time, the government has a different obligation to protect civil liberties and civil rights than an organization like Google or Facebook or Amazon. So while privacy on the main may not be a concern on everyone's radar, it is very much a concern for certain demographic minorities. There are different concerns for transgender people. There's many different relationships to privacy, and the federal government has a different obligation to protect the privacy of those individuals than what we see from Google. So I think not only do we need technologists and civil liberties and privacy law experts, we need people who understand, we really need those interpersonal relationships and that understanding of how the sociology behind privacy really works as we think about these data collections and how we think about our privacy.
Interesting. Anybody want to add anything? If not, I want to pull it back to just for a moment to education. What is the future role of online learning post COVID-19? So, in other words, what did we not do with it before that we're going to see evolve?
Or the only learning that is happening right now.
Right, but it is, and if the world only existed on the internet, that wouldn't change. But for now, we still exist in the real world, and I believe that kids are going to go back to school, because one of the things I talk about, school is more than what happens in the classroom. It's the way we've actually constructed modern society. You know, parents depend on their kids being away for a certain number of hours and occupied. It's just part of it. So I'm curious what if any of you have thoughts on the technology's role in what I believe is going to start to look more like a hybrid type of education between classroom experiences and technology. Are things like Khan Academy going to become even more relevant, or are there other types of maybe more localized technology, that can create more personalized and individual learning?
I have a bit of a theory on this, even though I am not an expert on education, just happen to work for a university. And I'm also, first of all, I'm also struggling to think about how I'm going to fill a 3-hour class that meets weekly next fall online. But I am starting to see like inklings of posts. I don't have children, but most of my friends do, of posts from parents on social media sharing like that they've been saved by this thing or that thing that has sprung up as a brand new kind of invention, innovative idea in this moment to help occupy their kids and teach them. So my friend in Denver signed her kids up for a virtual summer camp that's doing all sorts of experiments and learning and teaching and activities and like physical activity, and it's all of the things, right, in the course of a 4-hour block of time. So she's got sanity that she can sit and actually do her work, and her kids are engaged, and she wasn't sure how it would work and whether she would still need to keep, really sort of keep watch. And it seems to be somewhat self-sustained, and these are like 5-year-old kids. So I think we're just going to see a whole new type of engagement that's far beyond what we are all used to from a traditional classroom, and is a lot more interactive and a lot more kind of mix and match. Would that we could all afford like VR headsets. I'm sure we could come up with something really great, but even in this very kind of basic approach where the best we can hope for is decent broadband, I think we're going to see really creative folks start showing up and providing opportunities that feel to kids like they're in the TV show, or like, they're kind of in the video game as they're learning in real time. I hope we'll see that at least. And then I hope someone will show me how to do it so I can keep my college students at Georgetown engaged next fall.
Yeah, what I wonder in that context too is if, and Travis, by all means, jump in, but just before you do, just what does that also mean in terms of device time with kids and, getting out of their bedroom for at least half an hour in a 24-hour period?
Well, I'll just add that I think one upside to this is just that we have been forced out of our normal routines, all of us. I mean, educators and students alike. It was early 2014 when there was the London tube strike. It forced all of these commuters to figure out new ways of commuting. And then after the fact, when the tube got back to regular service, 5% of them had decided that their new way of commuting was actually more efficient or preferable to the old way of commuting. I heard anecdotally from a good family friend who has a kid that was struggling in part because of their one-to-one interpersonal connection with their teacher, that going virtually because of less social anxiety and the inability to really connect one-on-one outside of a really big group context has actually been really helpful for the student. So my hope for the pandemic is that this has really uprooted some old routines that may not have been the best routines, and that will, whether it's, and I think we will adopt. What those look like, I have no idea. I don't have kids, and so I'm not an education expert either. But my hope for everyone, especially the education sector as large, is that we've been forced into this new context, and we've found a few ways that are more efficient or more beneficial to us, or that make us happier in some small ways, that we can carry with us after this crisis is over.
Yeah, I just want to read something that came in from somebody who's joining us online. She says, as a parent, I can say that there have definitely been a lot of innovative and creative engagements for kids, both virtual and physically socially distant. But I will also add that it's not right for every young student, as my 5-year-old has really struggled with the virtual classes and virtual play. There needs to be some balance and consideration that everyone learns differently. Which is absolutely true. I mean, my great hope for technology, the education sector's great hope for technology, was that it allows us to personalize learning and create some equity in education. What I think we're finding out right now is that technology is actually doing the opposite, probably because of that lack of transitional infrastructure, lack of broadband, all the things that we're saying. And we're even seeing it in the work environment. There are people that can work from home, and there are people that cannot. And in many cases, there are pretty clear socioeconomic lines that can be drawn as to who can and who can't. And that gap is widening because of technology. So my great hope for technology is that we are able to come out of this with an implementation and a transition that enables, broadband being a huge part of it, that enables technology to be the great equalizer in all of these, and especially in education. So with that, I would like to thank all the panelists, invite you to say a couple of closing words if you want. And in fact, I will ask you to also let people know where they can learn more about your work and yourself, so that they can follow along and gain some more of your wisdom. So if you would each start maybe in the order that you spoke. So Cori, maybe you can give us that first.
Let me get unmuted. Well, I just want to say thanks again. This was a fun conversation and really interesting to examine so many of the issues that I love to geek out on. Data and transparency and oversight and accountability, privacy, and so many nerdy things. But it was a really great discussion with all of you, and appreciate just a lot of the thought, especially from folks who are working on so many just crucial and critical parts of this work, the bridging the digital divide and considering how we can get more people connected better, which is crucial for all of the other things that we've been talking about and care about. So thank you. And I'll drop my contact info and links and coordinates into the chat.
Great, thank you, Cori. Appreciate it. Ravi?
Well, I echo everything that Cori said. It's been a terrific conversation. It's also great to know that there's a community within this community of of people who I should be talking to, but I have not been talking to. So thank you for bringing this together. I think these 90 minutes have made me more intelligent, and made me smarter. So thanks everyone. Again, I'll drop my coordinates and also I'll share links by email of some of the stuff that we've been working on.
Sounds good. Yeah, I see it coming into the chat, and then we'll make sure that if this conversation is posted somewhere after the fact, we'll make sure to include all that information in that as well. Travis?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me this evening. I guess if you're on the East Coast, afternoon still for us on the West Coast. I will just put in a plug that we are going to be opening up applications for our next class of fellows in about a month. So for our Congressional Innovation Fellowship. So we look for computer scientists, engineers, and other technologists that want to try their hand and serve in government on policy issues. So everything from data privacy to encryption to election security. There is never a time that the skills are as needed as now. So if you know a good candidate, please send them our way, and we'll throw information in the chat also.
Great, Travis. Thank you. Karina?
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I would definitely look to the Data Coalition at datacoalition.org, as well as our sister organization, the Data Foundation, for a lot of research on this. I will also send my coordinates through the chat. And just as a final plug, I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't yet, please fill out your 2020 census. And hopefully before a census taker has to come to your door, you can do it online or by phone.
Sounds great. Thank you. And again, my name is Ravi Hutheesing. You can find me at raviunites.com. And of course, want to thank everybody at the High Institute for putting this together so that we could have this conversation and share it with others as well. I know I learned a lot. I think we all learned a lot from each other, which is great. That's the best kind of conversation to have. So thank you all for joining. You can learn more about the High Institute. I believe it's highinstitute.org. And High Institute at all the social media handles as well, at High Institute. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all again.